This presentation on the new perspective on Paul was developed by Dr. Robert Wayne Stacy at Liberty University. He is a colleague of mine, and I actually teach in one of his Pauline introduction courses, and we use this presentation every term with students. I think it is a profoundly helpful overview of the new perspective, and I am really grateful that he granted me permission to use the script to put together this presentation for you. So I hope you enjoy it, and I thank him for the opportunity to use his material. When considering Paul's view of the law, especially as it takes expression in the two letters where he treats that subject most fully, Galatians and Romans, one must be careful about too quickly and tacitly assuming that by works of law, Paul necessarily meant doing good works as a means of achieving salvation, equating that with Pharisaic Judaism as a legalistic religion, and then presuming, absent of a careful study of Paul's own writings, that this is what he meant by the phrase. To be sure, Paul did say, and said unequivocally, that no one is justified by works of law. No argument there. But the question is, what exactly did Paul mean by works of law? That is precisely where the debate lies among Pauline scholars. The larger context of the debate relates to how Paul understood first century Judaism relative to his critique of the works of law. The traditional interpretation, deeply rooted in the Reformation proclivity of reading Paul against the great backdrop of Luther's debate with the Roman Catholic Church as the great exponent of the central doctrine of the Reformation, namely justification by faith, interprets Judaism of Paul's day as a foil for that view and consequently understands first century Judaism as the champion of law-derived salvation and the inevitable legalism that such a perspective produces. As James D. Dunn put it in his Mason Memorial Lectures at the University of Manchester in 1982, and I quote, "Since Paul's teaching on justification by faith seems to speak so directly to Luther's subjective wrestlings, it was a natural corollary to see Paul's opponents in terms of the unreformed Catholicism which opposed Luther, with first century Judaism read through that grid of the early 16th century Catholic system of merit." The new perspective view is slightly different. The problem is that when you actually investigate the evidence derived from the writings of early Judaism itself, namely the rabbinic literature, that is, when you let Judaism speak for Judaism, this Reformation portrait of Judaism assumed by the traditional interpretation of Paul does not square with the evidence. Consequently, new perspective scholars such as Dunn, N.T. Wright, Kister Stendhal, and A.P. Saunders, and others argue that it is not so much that Paul has been misunderstood as that the picture of Judaism drawn from Paul's writings is historically false. Dunn and others argue, with considerable evidence on their side drawn from early rabbinic sources, that what is traditionally taken to be the Jewish alternative to Paul's gospel, namely a draconian, dispirited religion of legalism that rendered its adherents in a catch-22 to have to but cannot, would have been hardly recognizable by an authentic expression of Judaism among first century Jews. Indeed, they argue, the first century Jews did not undertake law-keeping as a means of earning salvation. Rather, they undertook law-keeping as an expression of their holy identity as the covenant people of God. For example, when I was a boy, my father used to scold me for bad behavior by saying, "Stacys don't behave that way." He wasn't saying, "Behave that way or you're not a Stacy." Rather, he was saying, "Behave this way because you are a Stacy." New perspective scholars, therefore, argue that the Judaism assumed by the traditional interpretation of Paul's view of the law was a false flag and not Judaism at all, at least as it was practiced by Paul's Jewish contemporaries, but rather a parody of Judaism. To be sure, these scholars argue Paul was critical of law-keeping, but not law-keeping as understood by the Reformation view. Rather, Paul was opposed to law-keeping when keeping the law was reduced to Jewish identity markers, that is, those ritual practices such as hand-washing, circumcision, kosher eating, Sabbath observance, and the like, which, since the time of the exile, marked out Jews as Jews. Things that in and of themselves were purely external and cultic. Paul, like Jesus in Mark 7, did believe that there were some things holy and some things unholy. What he disbelieved was that those things were merely a matter of something outside the person. Therefore, these scholars argue when Paul says no one is justified by works of law, but rather by faith of or in Christ Jesus, he is saying two important things. Number one, no one has ever been marked out as the people of God merely by keeping external and ceremonial works of law. For example, Jews were not the only ones practicing circumcision. Hence, practicing circumcision alone did not automatically mark out one as a member of God's people. And then number two, because being associated with the people of God is not about and never was about merely external ceremonial observance or works of law, but rather faith in the God who saves and who is now saving through his Son, Jesus. That means that Gentiles as well as Jews can now be counted among the covenant people of God. The question is, who is right? The traditional interpretation of Paul or the new perspective? And on what evidence from first century Judaism is one's view based? Some help might be found in a key passage in which Paul talks about the works of law and its impotence to bring about righteousness. A key passage, perhaps the key passage in this regard, is Galatians 2:16. Knowing that a man is not made righteous out of the works of law, rather through faith of Jesus Christ, and we have believed in Messiah Jesus in order that we might be made righteous out of the faith of Jesus Christ and not out of works of law. For out of works of law shall no flesh be made righteous. Stacy's translation of the Greek. There are three key issues in this passage that need to be sorted out if we're to get a clearer understanding of exactly what Paul was saying about the relationship between law-keeping and salvation. Number one, what does Paul mean by works of law? Number two, what does Paul mean by faith of Jesus Christ? And number three, what does Paul mean by justified, or as I have translated it, made righteous? With respect to works of law, there are two different scholarly views. The traditional Reformed view, by works of law, Paul means that the disposition that one can do good works in order to earn salvation. The New Perspective view is that Paul does not mean works of law, the disposition to do good works to get salvation, but rather works of law in first century Judaism meant identity markers of Judaism. That is, such things as circumcision, Sabbath observance, and eating kosher. Doing these works of law were what marked Jewish people as Jews, that is, as members of the covenant people of God. It wasn't that first century Jews did these things in order to be saved. Jews never believed, for example, that circumcision alone saved anybody. Rather, they did these things because they were Jews. That is, these things marked them out as the people of God. Paul, on the other hand, argues that it is not doing works of law that marks one out as the people of God, but rather it is faith of Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, that does so. Consequently, even Gentiles can be part of the covenant community because being in the covenant community is not marked out by circumcision, Sabbath observant, or eating kosher, but rather it is marked out by the faith of Jesus the Messiah. Which of these two perspectives seems to you a better understanding of what Paul means in Galatians 2:16? The second question turns on the meaning of a phrase Paul uses in several places in his letters, places like Romans 3:22 and 26, Galatians 2:16 and 20, chapter 3, 22 to 23, Philippians 3:9, and Ephesians 3:12. The phrase is pisteos Iesu Christou, which is translated faith in Jesus Christ, which is how it is traditionally and popularly understood, or should it be translated the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, which is how the NIV translates it in an alternate reading. More precisely, is the genitive pisteos Iesu Christou an objective genitive, faith in Jesus Christ, or a subjective genitive, the faithfulness of Jesus Christ? If the latter is what Paul meant, and that is increasingly the consensus of Pauline scholars, then the phrase would mean one or both of the following: Jesus' faithful obedience to God's call that he be the suffering Messiah, and Jesus' trust in God's own trustworthiness, reminiscent of Job's words, "Though you slay me, yet will I trust you," in Job 13:15. The Greek will support either the objective or the subjective genitive. The third question is, what does Paul mean by his Greek word dikaiosune, which is translated either justified or made righteous? There are two perspectives on this, which correspond to the two perspectives above, traditional and new perspective. The Reformed perspective is, by justified, Paul means the initiatory act of God in saving someone. That is, God's initial act of saving someone that we would call today conversion or being saved. The new perspective outlook is that Paul did not mean God's initial act of salvation, but rather justification or being made righteous is God's acknowledgement that someone is a member of the covenant people of God. Yes, you are one of mine. Whether that is an initial acknowledgement or a repeated action of God, that is God's ongoing saving acts, or God's final vindication of his people. Again, the question is, which of these two perspectives seems a better understanding of what Paul means in Galatians 2:16 and elsewhere? The new perspective has raised our awareness of how deeply Luther's reading of Paul has permeated the church. Indeed, if you've never heard of Martin Luther and the Reformation, would you still read Paul the same way? The impact and influence of Luther's reading of Paul is so deep and pervasive that it's hard to hear Paul's voice come through over Luther's. When we read Paul, what we have been conditioned to hear is not Paul, but Luther saying, now, what Paul means by this is. Moreover, the new perspective has taught us to let first century Judaism speak for first century Judaism rather than anachronistically interpreting first century Judaism through the filter of the late 15th century medieval Catholic Church. On the other hand, the traditional perspective is right when it insists that in at least some of Paul's writings, his critique of the works of law is precisely what the traditional perspective says it is, namely, a critique of legalism. The law as a means of earning salvation, not merely identity markers of Jewish ethnicity. The truth, it seems, lies somewhere in between.